Okay, going to do a quick Syracuse real estate, CNY real estate Q&A. So just going to get right into it. If you come across anything and you have any more questions, feel free to book a call. Happy to chat with you about it. And as always, give it the old like and subscribe if you want to get some more info on CNY real estate. So most common inspection problems you see in older CNY homes. So Central New York does have a lot of very old homes. So all the way from the mid 1800s up to about the 70s is when there were lots of homes built. We had not many homes built from kind of the 70s into the 2000s, and then some newer builds have started up since then. But you do get a lot of homes that are late 1800s, early 1900s into the 1920s, 1930s, and then we had a lot of pre-war, post-war, so 40s, 50s, 60s. There's a fair amount of homes in that range as well. So depends on exactly what you're talking about as far as like truly old homes. But if we're talking about like 1920s and earlier, they've got stone foundations. These types of like truly old homes. One of the most common ones are slanted floors. And so this is not necessarily like a huge issue or a safety issue. And it's really it's gonna bother different people, different amounts. So some people are super sensitive to it, and it's just a total deal breaker for them, which can't blame them, But then some people just don't really care about it, and they care more about the space. And then you get taller ceilings a lot of times with the older homes, and there's kind of a charm to older homes that you just don't get with modern homes. So everyone's a little bit different with that, but essentially it's just these old stone foundations are going to settle unevenly. And so even though the house is still sturdy, it's not like it's going to fall over. It's noticeable when you're walking around that the floors are not perfectly even. So now something you can do is you can add bracing in the basement, and that's going to kind of even it out. So any of the lower spots you can brace up. The problem is then that's going to affect the second floor or the third floor if you've got multiple stories. So that's where your first floor you can usually finagle a bit to get it a little bit closer, but then that's going to have an impact on the second and third floor. So I've seen houses where the first floor ended up being relatively flat, but then the second floor was like dramatic. Like you're walking through the hallway and you feel like you're in Willy Wonka or something. So that's definitely a very common one. Then the other one that you see a lot is just dated mechanicals. So on the electrical side of things, most houses have been upgraded to circuits, but you do still see some fuse boxes here and there. But then even the ones that have been upgraded to circuits, a lot of times you're going to have old wiring that's not grounded, and you might have not enough amperage. So if you've got a big house and you've got 100 amps of ungrounded wiring, you just kind of know you're going to have to spend a fair amount of money to pull more amperage from the road. Then you've got to upgrade the panel and upgrade all the wiring. So for a smaller house, 100 amps could be fine, but really you probably want to be in the 150 to 200 range, and modern builds are going to be 220 amp service. So that's very common. And then we do just see a lot of the old braided cables that are non-grounded cables. And so that's where, and I'm not an electrician, but my understanding is you can cut those wires, route them through a junction box to add the ground, and then run the new wiring to the outlet. So it's a solvable problem, but if you're pulling more amperage from the road and upgrading your electrical panel and your wiring, that's going to be a non-trivial expense. That's going to probably be into the high four figures, potentially low five figures, depending on exactly what you need to do. But that's a non-trivial expense. So that comes up fairly often because again, a lot of most of the really old houses were built without electricity at all. They were built without electricity and without plumbing. So all of this was added in later. And then, when it was added in the 40s and 50s, that's not exactly modern wiring and modern plumbing. So hopefully it's then been upgraded again since then. But a lot of times it hasn't. So a lot of times you do have the older electricity, the older plumbing, that type of stuff. And that's where it can really, it can get pretty expensive. Then the other thing you see fairly often are the old octopus furnaces, they call them. They're just like these huge things with giant arms coming off of them. So that's why they call them octopus furnaces. The real issue with those last for frickin' ever, but they're not particularly efficient. And then the real issue is all that ductwork has asbestos. So that is not as simple as just plugging in a new furnace and being good to go. You've got to take out all that old ductwork, and again, that's not as easy as taking out ductwork because it's asbestos ductwork. So you have to get someone who knows what they're doing, who's doing it properly. So that's definitely something to pay attention to. Is if you see a house with an old octopus furnace, that's going to be a non-trivial expense as well. Okay, so what is the difference between boiler heat and forced air? So those are the two most common types of heat that we see in Central New York. So the boiler systems are a unit that is heating up water, and then it's sending those water through pipes into the baseboard heating on the floor, and then we are getting radiant heat off of the pipes that are heating up. So the pros of the boilers is that they last a lot longer. They're more like a 50-year timeline or even beyond that. And then when they do break, they're usually repairable. So it's like a part that breaks, and then that part can be replaced or repaired, which is very nice. And then they're more efficient is the other thing. Now, it's not going to be crazy. Like the high efficiency forced air units, it's not like they're very far behind. But yeah, but boilers, they last longer, they're more repairable, they're more efficient. The problem there being, there's no ductwork in the house. So if you want to add AC, you can't add just central air to a house that only has boilers. Now, the solution to this, some people will add an AC unit in the attic. So if you have an attic crawl space, you can add the AC in the attic, and then you run the ductwork through the ceiling, right? So the boiler heat is running through the floor, which is good because heat rises, and then you've got your ductwork for your AC in the ceiling, and then the cold air falls. So that is a pretty good solution if you have a crawl space in the attic that is usable for that. Then the other thing you can do is you can run mini splits on the walls. So those are probably the most elegant the most elegant solution that is not just having central air. So the nice thing about those is all of the loud and the hot parts of an AC unit are outside. All you have is the cold air blowing. Now, having those on your walls, it's not exactly like they're pretty, but that's better than like a big loud window unit or a portable AC unit that you can move to room. Is convenient, but the loud part is all inside your house, And then same thing with the windows. They do put the loud part on the outside of the window, but it's still much louder than a mini split is. So that's the downside of the boilers. For the forced air units, they're going to last more like 20, 25 years. Sometimes you get 30. And it's really just down to luck. Obviously, servicing them is going to extend the life of them. So definitely get them serviced, change the filters, all that. But the problem with those is when they break, usually it's that the heat exchange goes, and that's not really repairable. You just have to get a brand new furnace. So that's where the boilers tend to be more repairable. The forced air units are just good until they're not, and when they're not, you gotta replace them. Now, the good news is all the ductwork is run, so for you to add AC is not going to be nearly as expensive as it's going to be to run AC through your attic, or even adding mini splits is probably going to be about the same price as just adding central air, and it's so much more elegant, it's quieter, it's got all those advantages. So that's how I think about boilers versus forced air. Okay, is it smarter right now to buy an updated home or a fixer-upper in CNY? So there's no really right or wrong answer to this. Mathematically speaking, it always makes sense. This is not a Central New York thing. This is just a real estate 101 thing. It always makes sense to buy a fixer-upper if you are someone who can fix up a house, So if you can swing a hammer yourself and you can do the upgrades yourself, it's kind of a no-brainer to buy a fixer-upper, and then you get all that built-in equity on the back end of it. But you need to be, so I am not a DIYer, so I learned that the first house I bought, I was like, oh, I'm going to do all these repairs myself. And then I, sold it in 4 or 5 years and pretty much had painted, and that was about it. So you kind of have to know what type of person you are. If you are a DIYer, or the other thing would be if you know people who can do repairs for you and you're not going to have to pay retail for them, so if your brother's an electrician, and he can come in and upgrade some stuff for you, and it's not going to cost you an arm and a leg. If you're not having to pay retail, then you really can get away with it. It is very easy to overspend on upgrades, though. That's I should do a whole video on flipping, but one of the reasons that it's actually relatively difficult to flip houses in Central New York is that the cost of the labor and the materials is so high relative to the property values that there's not a ton of meat on the bone when you're doing those upgrades. So it's very easy to accidentally overspend when you're upgrading a house, and so that's where you just want to be careful. The cheat code just being, if you're doing it yourself, there's really no way to lose. And the other thing I always, when I'm advising clients on this type of question, is just like, do you want that level of headache in your life? Like, are you running around with 2 young kids and you work, a full-time job and you got a side hustle and yada, yada, yada? Do you want contractors coming in constantly and you're doing project management, as your side gig essentially on your own house? So part of it is just like, do you want this in your life or not? So either if you're not a DIYer, you don't have the infrastructure to get the repairs done below market value, it probably makes more sense to just buy a house that's already updated. And you can kind of go do like a room by room, if you want to paint or, do a couple of things here and there, it's more doable. But, if you're a super busy person, buying a fixer-upper is just the quality of life aspect of it is worth some amount of money there. Okay, how does winter change the CNY market? So there's no like real cheat code for the best time to buy in Central New York, at least in this current market that we are in, the kind of the post-COVID market. And the reason there being is, even though there is a dip in demand in the winter, there's also a dip in supply. So the problem is, for you to have an advantage as a buyer, you need the ratio of buyers to sellers to be more favorable. And there's essentially no time of year that it's truly favorable for buyers versus sellers. Right now, we just have a severe lack of inventory. So there are just always more buyers than sellers. Even when the number of buyers dips, the number of listings dips at the same time. And so that ratio is just never really favorable for buyers. So in terms of like the pure mathematics of it, there's not really a cheat code as far as the best time to buy. And that's kind of same for listing as well. Kind of the traditional wisdom is list in, May, June, July. And there is some truth to that. Like if you look at the median home values, they do tend to peak in the summers. So there definitely is some truth to that. But in general, if you have a nicely presented home, you're likely to end up with multiple offers, whether you end up listing in December or January, or if you list in May or June. So there's not exactly a right or wrong answer here. And in general, I would just advise you make the decision based on your life and when you need to have a home or when you need to sell the home, and less about trying to time it. It's just very difficult to time. Then outside of the mathematics of it, on like the listing side of things, you can just get really unlucky, and you list your house on a Thursday, and then that weekend there's a giant snowstorm, so it's like, okay, well, your open house is busted now, no one's showing up to that, and then people are canceling showing. So there is more, now that can happen in the summer too, obviously not the snowstorm, but you could get, you get a bunch of rain, you could just have bad weather and still get unlucky. It's just, people can still drive, when it's raining or when it's nasty out. In the winter, if you get 3 feet of snow, nobody's going anywhere. So that's something to consider. Also, like the pictures just don't come out as nice. The weather's not as favorable for drones, so you might not get as many cool drone shots, that type of thing. Showings tend to get rescheduled more. As people are like, I'm looking at the weather. Let's try to do it tomorrow instead. You get more of that, less consistency there. And then really the big one is that we kind of run out of daylight by 4:30, 5 o'clock. When most people are getting out of work. So in the summer, you can schedule showings, to 8 p.m. and everyone can go and see it, and they get to see what it looks like in the light. Whereas in the winter, it becomes a situation where you're very likely going to have to schedule multiple showings. If you end up seeing a house at 6 o'clock and it's pitch black out, yeah, you got a sense for the inside, but you want to see the outside of it. And so it ends up, requiring multiple showings. So, that's kind of the long and short of it for how the winter changes the central New York market. Okay, which repairs and upgrades actually move the needle for CNY buyers before you list? So I actually have a video, it'll be coming out soon, about the highest ROI repairs and upgrades you do. But essentially the biggest one by a mile is just getting it as clean and decluttered as possible. And there's a thing where when you're living in your house, you stop noticing, little things here and there. They kind of become background noise to you. Whereas if you get a professional cleaning service in, they're going to wipe down the baseboards and these types of things that someone like me, not super detail oriented, I miss that, especially in my own house when I get used to it. Where a professional cleaning service is just really going to do a much better job than most people. Now, some people, I actually had a listing recently with 2 of the cleanest people I've ever met in my entire life. And when I went to their house, they didn't do anything to prepare the house for me. And I was like, if we had to list today, we absolutely could. So if you're that type of person and you just, your house is always spotless, then this doesn't apply to you so much. But for the overwhelming majority of people, a professional deep clean is so worth it. And then same thing with decluttering, is just get as much stuff out of your house, put it in closets, put it in sheds, get a storage unit if you have to. In the basement, anything like that. But just kind of get the stuff out of the rooms, and it's just going to make the rooms look a lot bigger. And when people are walking around, it's going to be easier for them to picture, okay, my couch would go like this, and I could put my desk over here, and I've got that bookcase I really love. It would look great there. Whereas if you just have stuff everywhere, it just makes it harder for the buyers to kind of imagine their life in the house. So number 1, number 2, number 3, and number 4 is cleaning and decluttering. Then going on beyond that, interior painting does make a huge difference. Especially if you're looking at doors, you get fingerprints, especially if you have kids. Those around the door handles kind of get grimy, and so painting the doors and things like that. It's a little bit more expensive. It's a little bit more time consuming. But even if you just say whatever, the 5 worst spots or whatever, these couple of doors and this room are the most beat up, I'll paint those. That is almost always going to be a surplus of value, right? Thinking how much does it cost to do? And then how much am I getting on the sales side of it? That's almost always a surplus of value. Then the other one is kind of exterior stuff. So just especially if you've got vinyl siding, just give it a good power wash. Give the driveway and walkway a good power wash. Some basic landscaping. Even just putting in some fresh mulch makes a huge difference. And that's another one where when you get used to what your house looks like, you don't really notice how big of a difference it is. Then you put in the mulch and you're like, oh my God, I can't believe I was living without this freshly mulched. So those types of things are not that expensive, not that time consuming, and they do make a really big difference. And from the seller, if you're selling your house, you want people in a positive frame of mind as they're entering. So if the outside looks immaculate, they're gonna be like, ooh, like, they're like this. They're already thinking positive thoughts, right? Like, as they're going in, they're happy about it. They already like the house. So that makes a big difference. Then the last one, and this is kind of the most expensive and time consuming, and the one that you got to think the most about, are like kitchen bathroom mini makeovers. So the kitchens and the bathrooms are by far the most value additive rooms in the house. And so where it doesn't really make sense to do like a full kitchen remodel, because it's just way too expensive, unless we're talking about like a higher end luxury house, it can actually end up being surplus of value. But painting the kitchen cabinets is a big one, because again, a lot of the houses around here are 40s, 50s, 60s. They've got the raw wood cabinets, which I quite like, but they just don't look very modern. So if you take a raw wood cabinet with like one of those old timey handles on it, and then you paint it and put a modern handle on it, it looks like a brand new kitchen. And yes, painting cabinets is a pain in the butt, and it is time consuming, but that really does make a huge difference on it. So kind of painting the cabinets, putting on a new countertop, like a quartz countertop is not crazy expensive, but it just looks and feels so much more premium than laminate. Again, 40s, 50s, 60s. All of those countertops were laminate back then. So if it's never been upgraded, that's one that's almost always going to be a surplus of value. And then things like changing the faucets, so the kitchen and bathroom sinks, those faucets, getting those upgraded will make a difference. A new mirror in the bathroom, that type of thing. So like the mini makeovers can be worth it, but there again, that's where we would want to have a conversation about it and just decide like so if you're listing your house, what are things that are going to be value surpluses, right? And then there's actually some things to think about where it may not be a technical mathematical value surplus, but there's a how quickly your house sells aspect to it that is also something to consider. So even if let's say you spent $3,000 on repairs and increased the value by $3,000, if it sold in 5 days instead of 20, like that was worth something too. So even though it's not worth something in the dollar amount, just getting it done and you're not having to go home and grab your dog and take it away for a showing. And, it's just, when your house is on the market, it's very, it's stressful. So the less time it's on the market, the easier it is on you. So there's some things that are worth doing just because it's going to sell quicker. It may not necessarily sell for more, or may not sell for more than you spent on the upgrade. But just the ease and the peace of mind of it is worth it. Does staging in central New York really matter, or will a good house sell anyway? So it depends on the house. For really high-end homes, lake houses, staging definitely will make a difference. And really for any home, it needs to be clean and decluttered. And so if we're talking about staging as in hiring a stager to stage the house, taking a vacant house and staging it, that's where I would recommend it for higher end, even mid-tier homes. For anything in the budget range or the step up range, it's probably not worth it. As long as the house is clean and decluttered, it's probably not going to make that big of a difference. And vacant homes sell all the time, and they sell perfectly fine. They're actually easier to measure and like things like that. So it's the vacant homes can be quite nice. And I always tell people, like, when they're getting their house ready to list, is the goal is to make it look like nobody actually lives there. So it's a little bit of overkill, but that's so like the paper towels, right? So if you've got and if you have a nice paper towel holder, it's fine. But like where I just have a piece of paper towel, not a piece of paper towel, a roll of paper towels just sitting on my kitchen counter, because because I need to grab paper towels. If I was listing my house for sale, that's where I would put it in a cabinet, so like that type of thing. Or like, if you've got food on top of your fridge, you got your cereal boxes on top of the fridge, like, yeah, that's when you're living there, that's totally normal. But that's the type of thing where like, just make it look like nobody actually lives there. Just pop those in a cabinet, if you need to. But yeah, so does staging work? It depends on the house, and it depends on whether you're actually living there or if it's vacant. But you do want to present it well, and that does always matter. Even in the hottest market available, presenting your house well always makes a difference. Okay, how do contingent offers work, and what to do when a seller also needs to buy? Okay. So there's two types of contingent offers. So one of them is where you're making an offer and you're saying it's contingent on the sale of my home. So when you accept my offer, I'm going to put my home on the market. and then within X number of days, either we will have it under contract, in which case we're moving forward, or we won't, in which case we will release the initial contract. That is very difficult to get accepted in Central New York, and usually it means the house you're buying is very unique, very expensive. It's got something that made it so that the sellers were compelled to accept that type of offer. That is very difficult, though. I think I've only had a couple of those in the last year that I actually got accepted. The second type of contingent offer is what's called pursuant to an existing contract. And so that's where we've already got your house under contract on the sale. And so we can say, look, we already know what it's going to sell for. The bank has already approved all these numbers. We're good to go. We're just going to take this contract. It's going to close. Then we're going to use the proceeds from that to purchase your home. That is very doable. Now, in a multiple offer situation, you're still going to be at a disadvantage versus someone who is non-contingent. But that contingency where you're pursuant to an existing contract is much easier to get under contract on than one where you're saying, I'm going to list my house once you accept my offer. And so that's what I always recommend to people who are doing a sell and buy, is just sell your house first and put in that contract that it is contingent on you finding suitable housing. So then if you don't find suitable housing, either both parties can extend the contract and you keep looking for suitable housing, or the contract goes away, everybody gets their deposits back, and nothing bad happens. So there's very little risk to this, because even if you don't find a house, it's not like you have to move. It's not like you have to sell the house. It's just the old deal goes away. And then if you do find a house, it's much easier to get it under contract than if your house wasn't already under contract. So that's my recommendation to people who are doing sell buy, is sell your house first, get it under contract, contingent on you finding suitable housing. Now take that contract and go make offers on another house that you want to buy. All that being said, if it's mathematically possible to treat them as two separate transactions, so buy the house separately from selling your house, that's 100% the way to do it. You will get a better deal on both ends of that. It'll be easier to buy, you'll get a better price, and it will be easier to sell because you don't have the contingency on finding suitable housing. Now, the problem there being, from the bank's perspective, you need to qualify for both mortgages simultaneously, right? So the other thing is your down payment is going to have to come from separate funds. You're not going to have the proceeds of your house sale. So there are kind of two problems there where you need to qualify for both mortgages and you need to have a separate fund for down payment. But if you can treat them as two separate transactions, that makes everyone's life a lot easier. Then what you do is you recast the loan. Right, so you bought this house separate from selling yours. You purchased this house and you only put a little bit down because you didn't have a huge chunk from the sale of your home. So you have a proportionally high mortgage payment. Then you take the proceeds from your sale and you recast your loan with those proceeds. Now that's taken into account. Now your mortgage is on a lower amount, and so your monthly payment goes down. So that is definitely the way to do it if you can swing it, but there's quite a few steps, as I just outlined, to make that happen. Okay, how do appraisal gaps work? And when does it make sense or not make sense to offer them? So what an appraisal gap is where you're purchasing a house for, let's just say, $100,000, and then the appraisal only comes back at $90,000. So now we have a gap between the purchase price on the contract of $100,000 and then what the house appraised for, $90,000. The problem here being the bank will only loan on the lower amount. So the bank is not going to loan on $100,000 if the house only appraises for $90,000. So appraisal gap coverage is what you're saying as the buyer is, I will cover that difference in cash. And so you can cap that amount. You can say, I will offer a $5,000 appraisal gap coverage. So in that example we talked about with a $100,000 purchase price, a $90,000 appraisal, then we would cover $5,000 and the purchase price would be lowered to $95,000, right? So you can give an unlimited appraisal gap. You can cap it at a certain amount. But there's two types of ways that I think about when I'm going to offer an appraisal gap. And one of them is if you have a large down payment. If you have a large down payment, there's essentially zero risk in offering an appraisal gap, because let's take that $100,000 house as an example again. Let's say you're putting $50,000 down and then you're borrowing $50,000 from the bank for your $100,000 purchase. Right? If we're going to offer appraisal gap coverage, let's say we're offering unlimited appraisal gap coverage, and then the appraisal comes back at $90,000, right? So now the bank is going to say, well, we're not going to loan on $100,000, we're only going to loan on $90,000. So then we're going to take $10,000 of your down payment and we're going to move it and pay it directly to the sellers at closing. So rather than it going to the bank as a down payment, it's going directly to the sellers. So now you're only giving the bank $40,000 as a down payment. They are still loaning you $50,000 for that $90,000 that the bank is willing to loan. Then you're adding the additional $10,000 on top directly to the sellers, and they still have a $100,000 purchase price. So net, you're still out of pocket $50,000. The bank is still loaning $50,000. So the deal did not change if you have a large down payment. Now, if you were only putting $10,000 down, we can't move that $10,000 directly to the sellers because the bank is going to require a down payment of some amount. Right. And so that's where, if you have a small down payment, that's where we really need to have a conversation about how much cash do you have on hand? Can you cover the down payment and cover the appraisal gap? And then are you willing to, and is it wise to? So appraisal gaps are not something that we can throw around willy-nilly, but if you do have a large down payment, there's very little risk. And if you have a small down payment, that's where you need to have a conversation about it. So like for me personally, when I'm buying, I have rentals in the area and I've had some primary residences. My personal investing philosophy is I try to put down as little as possible. I want to keep the cash on hand. In my opinion, there's some problems that get solved with cash on hand that don't get solved by having equity in your house. So I want to have that cash on hand as a little safety blanket. So if I have an appraisal gap, I have a problem because I was not planning on, the cash that I was using for the down payment was the only cash I was planning on using. So I'm going to have to bring in separate funds to cover an appraisal gap. Right. And so that's where, depending on your down payment, that's where it really gets important to think about that appraisal gap and get granular with it. We can't just be throwing them around willy-nilly. Okay. What is a DSCR loan and when does it make sense for investors in CNY to use it instead of a conventional loan? So a DSCR loan is a debt service coverage ratio loan. So the way a DSCR loan works is that the bank is analyzing the asset and they are saying, does the cash flow from the asset cover the debt service? Right, so they're looking for a ratio where the cash flow is going to cover the debt service. So the nice thing about this is that they're really analyzing the asset. They're not so much analyzing you. A conventional loan, they're saying, can you afford these payments? A DSCR loan, they're saying, can the asset justify these payments? So the nice thing there is there's just much less paperwork that you have to do. For a conventional loan, it's like insane how much paperwork you have to do. They go through your tax returns, your W-2s. They're going to go through your bank statements. If you Venmo'd your mom $60 for groceries, they're going to say, "Hey, who was that to, and why'd you spend that money?" So it's you gotta donate a kidney. You have to give them naming rights to your firstborn. A conventional loan is just an enormous amount of paperwork, whereas a DSCR loan, they are mostly analyzing the asset. Now, every lender is going to have a different amount that they kind of worry about you and your qualifications. But generally speaking, what they're looking at is the asset. And the nice thing about Syracuse is that pretty much every single house cash flows better than the DSCR lenders require in order to purchase the home. So pretty much every house is going to qualify for a DSCR loan, and then you're doing much less paperwork than you would have to on a conventional loan. Now, with a DSCR loan, the other thing you can do is you can put it in an LLC's name, where a conventional loan typically is going to have to be purchased in your name. Now, you can transfer title, but that's where you need to be careful. When you transfer title, many conventional loans have what's called a due on sale clause. So when you transfer title, technically, that can be considered a sale, and then the bank can call your note on that. Now, my understanding is that most of the time that does not happen, and I do see plenty of people who buy in their personal name and then transfer title and keep the existing mortgage. But that's a conversation you need to have with your attorney ahead of time, just to make sure that you're going to be rock solid on that. Whereas a DSCR loan, you can put it directly into the business and into an LLC's name. So that's another advantage of DSCR loans. Now, DSCR is going to require 15, 20, or 25% down, depending on the lender, whereas a conventional loan, a multifamily owner-occupied conventional loan, you can go as little as 5% down. And so that's where, if you're going to owner-occupy a multifamily, that's where I would definitely, and you want to minimize your down payment, that's where it's almost always worth going conventional and doing some extra paperwork so that way you can save all that cash versus a 20 or 25% down. That makes a huge difference on your cash out of pocket. All right, let me know if you have any questions or if you're looking to buy or sell in Central New York. Feel free to book a call, and I'd be happy to chat with you about it.